Hello, everybody. Really warm welcome. My name is Alicia. I work for The Big Draw. We're an arts education charity and the driving force behind the world's largest drawing festival. We were established by the Guild of St George, and that Guild of St George was actually founded by John Ruskin himself. So that's how we're all related. Just a bit of context for tonight. The John Ruskin Prize exhibition is an annual open call exhibition showcasing contemporary artists whose work responds to John Ruskin ideas around art, society, environment, and social justice. And it's my absolute pleasure to pass over to our chair sort of person for this evening, and that's Neal. So I'll pass over to you, Neal. Lovely.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Good evening, everyone. My name's Neal Shasore. I was one of the judges on the prize this year, and a great honour to be so. I'm an architectural historian. I trained in art history and was taught by a Ruskinian, and that imbued in me a great love for Ruskin's writing, Ruskin's thought, and indeed the whole kind of Ruskinian um, uh, approach to the production of visual art, of craft, and indeed of architecture. And for some years, I ran an organization called the London School of Architecture, where I tried in turn to imbue a love of Ruskin in my students. So really happy to be here, very privileged to be here indeed with the three artists that join us this evening, Lena Heinrich, Kishwar Kiani, and Luke Alen-Buckley. We're going to have three separate sections, each in turn. We'll start with Kishwar, then on to Lena, and then Luke. And we've asked each of the artists to put together a presentation that tries to express the link as they see it, as the artist sees it, between their work and Ruskin's, or a Ruskinian theme, to give us some insight into their process, their analytical process, but also their processes of production, of crafting, of fabrication, and so on, to show us some of the wonderful work that they had on show at the exhibition. And in the case of Lena, award-winning work, and Kishwar and Luke also participated in the exhibition as shortlisted artists. And we should say, and Alicia might be able to help me with the stats, but I think there was just under 5,000 submissions to the prize this year. We, as judges, had the unenviable responsibility to whittle that down to around 87 or 89 entries, and from that made our awards last Wednesday down at Trinity Buoy Wharf. So a huge achievement to participate in the exhibition, and it was really fabulous to see the work in person last week. So we'll see the work that was shortlisted, and in Lena's case that was prize winning, and perhaps one or two other examples of the artist's work as well. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to, I hope not entirely irritatingly, interject with questions and observations. The viewing audience can be assured that I'll ask very obvious questions, and so there'll be no embarrassment about asking our artists to state the obvious if we need to. So let's get going. We're going to start with Kishwar Kiani. Kishwar is a visual artist and academic whose practice examines how order and chaos coexist through the metaphor of scaffolding. Shaped by growing up in a conservative environment, she understands space as a constantly shifting framework, built, altered, and dismantled in cycles of control and resistance. Working with skeletal structures informed by psychogeography, her sculpture navigates moments of structure and collapse, inviting viewers to move from passive observation to active engagement within these charged spaces. She holds an MA in Fine Art, Drawing from the University of Arts, and was a Chevening Scholar in 2020-21, and has exhibited nationally and internationally at the Saatchi Gallery, South London Gallery, MK Gallery, National College of Art, and Royal Society of Sculptors, where she is a member and was recipient of the Gilbert Bayes Sculpture Award in 2024. So over to you, Kishwar.
That's a brilliant introduction, Neal. I would not have said all of those things for myself, really. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you could, Alicia, if you could help me put on the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'll just jump straight into the presentation. This is the piece that I relate to most because it came from staying with something for a very long time without fully knowing where it would end up. It was also only the second time that I was making work in response to an open call theme. So I was learning how to listen to the brief, to the material, to my own instincts as well, really. And somewhere in that process, I found myself returning to John Ruskin's study of moss fern and wood sorrel upon a rocky riverbank. It's a relatively small-scale study in his journal, but one he worked on for over 4 years, I believe. And coming back to it again and again to the same patch of ground to study it, I feel was something that I wanted to incorporate into my own practice as well. And what draws me to this study is how nothing in it grows freely. Like you see the moss, the fern, the wood sorrel, they don't spread outward. They in fact adapt, constantly negotiating the space that is around them. And growth there isn't about expansion so much as endurance, about finding ways to exist under pressure. And that way of thinking fed directly into how this work Airbnb that I've exhibited with Trinity Boywolf made for the John Ruskin show developed in that particular way, because I spent months trying to understand tumbleweeds, not as symbols, but as structures, because I began physically restricting them, first inside boxes and later within the outlines of a house. And I wasn't trying to stop growth. I'd like to mention that here. I merely wanted to study how it would behave when it's contained. So because of this, the process became slow and repetitive by necessity, where I kept returning to the material, testing it, remaking it, and letting the work build gradually over time. And I started to see that every day that a few hours into making, the repetition started to feel therapeutic. And it's part of the process that I think I enjoyed the most in this series. So for me, the connection matters a lot because it reframes patience as a methodology and not really as a virtue. Whether it's the moss pressed against the rock or the tumbleweed pressed into a domestic space, growth doesn't disappear under restriction, you see, it mutates. And that mutation is where my work lives now. And what I absolutely loved about Ruskin's study here is that he developed this discipline of going back to work he had put aside and rework it. And I'm sure over that period of time, over the period of 4 years, he must have revisited every stroke to improve on his textures. And that kind of dedication is quite commendable and something that I want to incorporate into my own practice as well. Alicia, next slide, please.
Hold on 1 second. Doesn't seem to be wanting to play. There we go.
So the area where I live now was barren land about 25 years ago. Even though it's fully urbanized today, it looked quite wild back in the day. And I remember when my father first bought the land, the elevation was covered in tumbleweeds. I don't even think that they grew there because, like most tumbleweeds, they had probably rolled in from some other place after detaching from the ground. And that strange organic form just sort of stayed with me. Now, fast forward to 2024, I was working on an architectural project, and my welding plant started splattering molten metal all over the structure. Now, if you have any of you have ever welded or have any experience of welding, you know that this points out to either an issue with the gas supply or the wire feed speed. So I was incredibly frustrated, and I couldn't find a solution on my own, nor did I have the experience back then. So like most artists, I started playing around with the welds instead. And what I noticed was that these organic leaf-like heads began forming on the stainless steel rods, and I decided to follow through with it. And I think what I wanted to study here was this dichotomy that existed between a form as wild and carefree as a tumbleweed, and the idea of containment, and how I could make it coexist within a structure. I'm sorry I couldn't include a video here since I think this was a short presentation, but the full process is on my social media if any of you want to have a closer look. For now, I think I'm going to simply try to explain it. So I began welding each strand in stainless steel, one at a time. Each strand goes through a certain set of stages. I start with a very basic structure, then I gradually add smaller bits and smaller fragments to it. And in the final stage, I use a stroke-like welding method on the ends to sort of mimic these tumbleweed seed heads and their irregular growth. And one thing I would want to point out here is that every strand is different from the one before it and the one that I made after it. So it's a very intuitive process and not something that I can or even want to at this point hand over to a fabricator or can easily translate or outsource, because every iteration responds to the last. Now, this, I believe, is where patience really comes into the making process, because every strand teaches me something that the previous one didn't, and the learning carries forward to the next. I felt like it was a continuous process for me, because the welding isn't just a technical step here, I feel. It's where most of the thinking and observing happens. So over a period of 30 days, I made roughly 800 of these strands. Each one was then individually ground and polished before we attempted to assemble the piece to its final form. Next, please. So as you can see, I started putting the strands together, and shaping them into the silhouette of a house was surprisingly tricky, but maybe that's the fun part of it. And we began from the bottom up, starting with something that was familiar, a simple rectangle in this case. And it felt like a small, steady foothold before letting the work grow on its own somehow. And on the right, you can see that I've reached about 6 inches in height, and starting from the bottom made it easier to get a head start on the overall form. Next slide, please. So this is the work that I've exhibited with John Ruskin, and this sculpture began with very careful and attentive looking and a conscious decision not to rush the form, because I spent weeks studying how tumbleweeds twist and latch onto each other and gather themselves. And I did this prior to translating any of these ideas or any of these gestures into metal. And the piece felt closer to drawing in space rather than construction, where every line sort of carries this weight and permanence. So from its general shape, you can see that it leans towards the outline of a house, as you can see. And in nature, a tumbleweed survives by moving and rolling along and keeping its circular shape as it spreads seed. But put it in one place and that rhythm and logic sort of collapses. So the sculpture reflects my experiences of working within a conservative environment where growth, like I've said before, is possible, but it's always shaped by limits, by domestic, religious, political limits. So something that begins mobile and organic is pressed into an architectural form in this space.
Kishwar,
And
sorry to interrupt, but could you
no,
tell us a
please.
bit about where the title came from and where um this form of the house uh, emerged, what significance it has in relation to tumbleweed as well?
So the title tumbleweed, no, sorry, the title Airbnb plays on the idea of temporary belonging. And because an Airbnb is a space where you can occupy that space, but never fully claim as your own. And I was drawn to that contradiction because an Airbnb is ultimately a place you pass through rather than root yourself in. And you can occupy it, you can adapt to it, you can function within it, but it always comes with a set of rules and limits. And one is always aware that that space isn't fully yours. I hope that answers it a bit, Neal.
It does. I wonder. It occurs to me actually that you made reference to the site, the plot of land that your father bought, and actually viewers, the audience may not know where you are. So I wondered actually if you could give us a sense of where you are
I should
and
have
how
mentioned that.
how that informs how I suppose, especially when you're exploring ideas of home and the fact that where you are now is different from where you studied, and presumably, therefore, there's a reflection on the process of migration and a metaphor with tumbleweed in that sense. If you, yeah, spell that out for us a bit.
So, well, thank you for pointing it out. I'd love my work to be about migration, but perhaps the subsequent works that I work on now would be more about that because
So where are you, Kishwar?
I live in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. It's a beautiful, busy area to be living in, but the area that I live in is it it was a bit of a hill where we've made the house and my parents' house, which I don't live in currently. And then I moved to London for my master's degree, and I lived there for a couple of years. And then I came back, and that migration sort of I can reflect that onto this piece as well because the movement is contained because I couldn't sustain living in London either. I had to come back. So when you talk about migration, it's also confined, as I've shown the tumbleweed, which is confined within that house, because I haven't had the chance to fully migrate and adjust and adapt to a different culture either. So it's growth, but it's contained within a structure at all in all of my pieces.
I wondered if you might tell us a little bit more about the observation of tumbleweed and how you've done that. And again, I suppose the tension between tumbleweed as kinetic in the sense as kind of wandering, right, as migratory, one could argue, versus this very static form. And I must confess, actually, that the relationship to tumbleweed had eluded me in my encounter with the piece last week and at shortlisting. That it seemed to me that these were much more kind of dendritic forms. I mean, they are dendritic forms, but that perhaps there was something more related to the growth of trees. So I'm curious to know more about tumbleweed.
Actually, the reason that I picked a tumbleweed is because tumbleweed lives even after it has died. It has detached from the ground. So it grows after its death more than it does within its life. Because a tumbleweed is merely just a plant. And when it dries out, it detaches from the ground. And as it rolls away with the wind, it forms this round shape. Now, if you look at the tumbleweed, the Airbnb, it cannot move around. It cannot roll on its own anymore. So it's restricted within a form. It's contained within a form. So the reason that I really wanted to work with it, because I sort of saw myself as a tumbleweed. I have had restrictions as an artist from a very earlier age. I was not allowed to practice art because sculpture in my region is still considered a bit of a taboo. I remember when I was starting out as a sculptor, my mother told me that I'd be thrown out of the house and the household if I continued working in sculpture. But, well, I opted for it anyway. But so I've had I've grown up without a support system of any kind. And tumbleweed sort of is, in a lot of ways, I envied even a plant as mundane as a tumbleweed because it had more freedom of going from one space to another and living and adjusting to another space than I did all my life. So I picked it as just a simple representation of something that I could play around. And instead of making it round, making it mobile, or a form that could move from one place to another, I've restricted it within a structure.
There's so much more I want to ask you, Kishwar. And time
Please
is
do.
already flying by. No tumbleweed for us. But just before we move on, I did want to ask about you talked about in a sense the almost accidental happening upon the form, and 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 then is it that you found its kind of representational potential immediately, or again, I'm sort of curious about how this observation of tumbleweed um, met this serendipitous accident in making, and how you kind of resolved that, because you now talk about this form, as it were, very confidently, metaphorically, as tumbleweed, and that seems to me to contrast with the way that you described finding the seed of the form.
I used to have a giant tumbleweed in my studio. I think I've moved it to the work studio now. I would have sort of shown it to you because it's very native to the area that I live in now, which is closer to my parents' place, by the way. But I can't really say that I knew what I was making when I started this piece, because I made a piece prior to this one, two pieces prior to this one, in which I sort of resolved some of my issues in making those tumbleweeds as well. But when I started, in fact, I think it's best that we move to the next slide. I think it'll explain a bit. So here you can see the first form that I made as an experiment of trapping something as carefree as a tumbleweed into a form, because it builds on the same idea, but here the structure takes the shape of a cube instead of a house. And this was made before Airbnb. You can see a clear difference in how I've treated and welded the strands. So the piece marks my first experiment with containing something that was inherently free form. So the cube shows that no matter, or perhaps this is how I felt at that time, that no matter how capable or creative you are, growth confined to a fixed structure can only expand or shine so far. So the tumbleweed doesn't stop growing. It simply learns the shape of the container when actually it's supposed to grow and gather more moss and sort of expand in size. But my tumbleweed is always contained within a form, within a fixed form. So for me, it also reflects on my personal experiences growing up in a conservative religious environment, how restrictions have shaped my art practice and made it incredibly challenging to stay true to myself. And in a way, this new series of work has been about dedication and discipline, qualities that I also see in Ruskin's work, while I think my practice merely scratches the surface. But I think aligning my approach with his way of making feels like a step in the right direction. So I think
Thank you so much. That's brilliant.
Thank you so much.
And I hope to bring you into the conversation as it evolves. I'm going to move us on now to Lena Heinrich, a Berlin-based multidisciplinary artist, designer, and environmental engineer. Lena trained initially as a craftsperson through an apprenticeship in a heritage millinery studio before studying water and environmental engineering in the UK. Over the following 2 decades, she's built an international career in the water sector, but in parallel has deepened her engagement with craftsmanship and design. In 2019, she founded her design studio in Johannesburg, marking a deliberate shift towards a material-led, hands-on practice. And we're going to hear, I hope, a little more about Lena's research around straw as a hyperlocal regenerative material with a renewed relevance across architecture, design, and energy, drawing on vernacular knowledge and traditional techniques, and the very beautiful work which won the inaugural Useful, Beautiful Objects Prize last week. Lena.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for reading all of that out and kind of a long introduction. As Kishwar said, that's quite a bit. And obviously I'm very thrilled and very, very happy about the prize. In particular, so I really love the work of John Ruskin and kind of the idea of the polymers and bringing different strands together. And this is why this has been specifically very special to me. And actually when I was asked to put together the slides and the question is about the Ruskin theme, actually for the first slide, what I chose is the cornfield, the grains and the wind. And as it happens, it actually is the cover of a book that I wrote before I actually even started touching the material itself. And it's really the ideas that I really connect to is that idea of working in a non-industrialized way in nature conservation and really observing what is in the nature around you. And as Neal just said, what I really wanted to do is work with a hyper-local regenerative material. And I had this idea informed of my 2 different backgrounds, in particular as a milliner where I worked a lot with straw, but that has been mostly imported from places such as the Philippines. And then I became a water engineer and I looked a lot at our plant life and what's on the surface. I particularly worked in hydrogeology, so I had a huge impact of how we treat our soils. And so I was like, okay, I want to be looking at what is actually on our doorsteps, what kind of materials are there. And then I went deep into what different types of grasses and straw do we have, because obviously we do associate straw as an agricultural byproduct, but really it's just a dried stem material. So the area is a huge area to study, but I really wanted to see what, if I stand on my doorstep in Northern Europe, what materials do I have? So I ended up writing 94 pages about straw in Northern Europe before I even touched one, because for me it was just important to understand also not only what do my choices have in terms of repercussions right here, but then also we are living in an interconnected world. What kind of does it mean if I choose something here and our economies are connected? So what are the global interconnectedness of it? And on the other hand, also actually in terms of craftsmanship, what history is there? What's gone before and how could this be translated into something contemporary? And so with that, I will actually take you onto the next slide already. No, it's not moving. There we go. Which brings you very, very closely to the material itself. So I had a lot of requirements when I started working with it. First of all, I wanted to develop a new technique in terms of craftsmanship. I didn't want to pick up anything that has gone before, because I do really believe that actually the only thing that tradition has in common is that it changes all the time, because otherwise tradition doesn't survive. So I don't really want to do museumification of craft, but really develop new techniques and kind of bring it further and kind of preserve through innovation. I wanted to make an item that is completely compostable. So in the idea also of Ruskin, do not do any harm. So I wanted to have something, because I also like the idea of that an object may just have a certain lifespan, and there's beauty also within that. So it was supposed to be compostable. It was supposed to be something that is for the interior space and kind of is exactly between that boundary of it's a piece of art, but it's also a functional object. So that was from the beginning part of the idea I wanted to do. And I wanted to really work also with a humble material. So because I believe it's a luxury item, it's like to make a beautiful diamond ring is much easier than just taking a humble material. And there's so much beauty also in the humble materials, and just through your own attention of care through the material, you can actually make it a beautiful luxury item. And then they really also, I got my first straw, and this is somewhat what I looked at, and what it happened to be is this beautiful rice straw. It has a really long history also in terms of craftsmanship. There's a whole chapter I wrote about it, about all the different types of craft that are related to rice straw. So I wanted to do something new. And when I first got it, what I also was somewhat disappointed about, and that is what everyone is shying away working with this material, is the notes that you can see here. So everyone is cutting out the notes. In terms of craftsmanship, this is actually with a waste material. And in the beginning, I was also, why did I not choose something else? And I know there was already a question about the patience and the kind of preservation and sinking. I had to lay it out, and then I spent a lot of time really peeling it to kind of get to that state. It's like I kept on walking around and kind of looking what it was asking me to do. And then I actually saw this beautiful pattern that starts to emerge when you start to peel the straw. And it has this natural tie-dye effect, which is basically where you peel off the leaves and where it has been exposed to the sun a little bit longer. So it's the weather that has created this tie-dye effect. When you then remove the leaves, you have that changing pattern. And so I came to realize that I actually really love the material, and I love in particularly the bit that everyone seems to discuss, because actually when I give you the attention and care and kind of look very closely, it's actually where for me the particular beauty of the material lies. So really very much relates actually to the theme of this year's Ruskin Prize, as in the patience in looking and truth in the making. Really, just letting the material speak.
If we might see the work. It occurs to me that the audience will not have necessarily a picture of it in their mind.
No problem. Actually, I might just go a step further. So this is a piece, and as you can see, it's very interesting to see it photographed by a lot of different people, because it keeps on changing, and kind of the depth of this tie-dye effect changes quite a bit depending on the way that's been photographed. But so this was my first real attempt on trying to make it work. And what also comes here into play, I had this idea that came into my head about bundling straw, that in fact if you do have a single fiber, it obviously breaks very easily, but if you start bundling it, it becomes incredibly powerful and has a lot of strength, just like paper. And so I did my first experiments. It took me a long time to work it out, how I could get it to stand and look just as if it magically stood up. But I got it to work, and this was the first piece. And also to reference also, so it's a pine wooden top that I used here, but also that goes back actually to vernacular furniture. That's how the inspiration came, looking at all of these old farmhouse furniture, and where kind of the centuries, well, the decades of sitting on the wood kind of starts creating the molds, and it starts to bend. And I wanted to pick up that element in the seat.
Lena, I was very struck, and am very struck by, dare I say, an ambiguity though, in the function of the piece, right? That it seemed to me that one might also read it as a brush, or as a sample of thatch, and so I wondered how consciously you were playing with the idea of a beautiful but functional and useful object in the form of a seat versus these other connotations?
So for me, it was very important that it also had a function and kind of has that border. And funny enough, my first intention was actually to do it the other way around, to have possibly the wood at the bottom and that you sit on the straw to really have that brush effect. And maybe I'll show you the last slide. This is a piece I just finished, and I just happen to have it both ways around. So this is a two-seater bench, which in fact has become incredibly strong, and also to show it really is just standing on the straw. And in this case, so the calculation is that it's about 30,800 single pieces of straw that it's standing on. The stool is much, much smaller in size, so that's around 2,500. But I and a friend can very happily sit also on the stool. But it's very, so now these photos have been taken and everyone just keeps on saying, it's like, I just want to touch it and want to run my hands through that brush effect. So, and in fact, it's, yeah, it's lovely both ways around. And I might still also develop a piece that way around where you actually sit on the straw, which also is, because it's much stronger than you might anticipate it to be, it would also be possible to actually have it this way around and sit on it.
And in terms of the design process and the I suppose the interlinking between the design and the testing through making, how could you just tell us a little bit about how that works? You know, the extent to which it's a kind of, I guess, like intuitive dialectic, or the extent to which you're experimenting, you know, reflecting. It seems like writing is a really important part of your practice as well. How does it all work?
So the first bit was I really wanted to understand the material. I mean, I've worked as a water and environmental engineer for over a decade. And I'm really I want to understand this. So I've done a lot of research studies, and this is kind of that scientist side. It's like, I don't want to touch it without understanding it, which very interestingly, some fellow designers were a bit like, oh, why all this work? But I was like, I really want to understand it. And I want to understand it within a greater picture, kind of what are the historic aspects, what are the social aspects to using it, what are the history in terms of craft and so forth. And then actually the way I went about it was I did a lot of practical tests. So I had this idea, but obviously it didn't work initially. So I don't have a picture of it right here, but I did a lot of small scale samples. So there's a little bit obviously to it, which is my little secret, as in to get it to work, to stand like this. But so I did lots of tiny samples, and I got also inspired so that I then had a look around. And actually what I looked at is setching, because that is in a similar way as these kind of bundles and the kind of strengths. And this is where I also looked at, it's like looking at the bundle itself and then also looking at all setching methods that inspired me and how I could get this to work.
Though, Lena, I do wonder whether aside from this very empirical approach and you know the scientific method that you've applied, it is both the object on display at Trinity Buoy Wharf and the object that we're seeing on the screen are beautiful. There's an aesthetic sensibility, and I just wondered whether you might share with us where that comes from, to what extent that's resolved through a process of design, or whether you feel that comes through the making, or simply because of the science.
It's a little bit of both. What I very often do in my process is to leave it lying in my line of vision, and I kind of shift it around. So for example, as you can see here, I evolved the pattern, and it's an interesting thing because it's nature, and you can do certain things with it, but other things you cannot. So I could restrict it, and this is a good example of it now, as in you could restrict the coloration in certain ways and make a pattern, but obviously because it's nature, the nodes are not always 20 centimeters apart. So you do have that irregularity happening at the same time. So in fact, it's an interesting bit, as in I do actually turn the thinking off when it comes to working with the material. I just have to see it. And it was also quite interesting with the stool, because I had this idea that it would be working, but I hadn't seen it before. And it's a lot of handwork. So actually there wasn't a prototype in a sense, as in I could first make a mock-up. That wasn't just possible. I had to put in all that amount of work, having a vision in my head, but I couldn't answer it if it was really going to work and look good until it was actually done. And then it's much more intuitive. I'm also with this, I spent a long time kind of considering different options, looking at leaving it on my table, all these kind of different samples of moving the notes up and down. And then it's the material who gave me the answer in the end. And kind of when I looked at it, I was like, this looks beautiful. And it's actually a little bit the opposite to what I did in the beginning. It's not the science at all. It's then, it has to come.
Lena, sorry, I am just aware that our Q&A is filling up a little bit, and there is one directed for you. I think you might have maybe
I think so.
answered this.
Well addressed.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it said it's from the Ruskin Society, actually. It says to Lena, reflecting Ruskin's view that imperfection reveals sincerity and human presence, how do you respond when uncertainty or flaws enter the work? I do think you've sort of answered that quite beautifully in regards to the type of straw and that notch, but do you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, no, actually it's exactly that. As I said, it's kind of like in the beginning I was really quite disappointed when I had the material. I was like, oh, what to do? But actually I had to sit with it and I had to observe it, and then it turned out, and and you can see where it's like there's much more to come, and pushing it the different way. It's like actually the imperfection of the material is the beauty thereof. And now I feel like, why haven't other people kind of picked up this beautiful tie-dye effect before? And I have so many ideas for different objects to come out of this technique as well. I'm working more actually with the pattern and with what before has been considered the imperfection of the material. But it also gives you trouble. I can tell you, it wasn't that easy to do the bench. So natural materials come with surprises all along the way. They don't want to bend like an injection mold. It's not that easy all the time. So the bench, to get it done, cost me a lot of headaches along the way.
Thank you so much, Lena, and yeah, really fascinating insight, both into process, but also I think into the multi-dimensional thinking and a whole range of unusual experiences and different forms of knowledge that find really fascinating and very enriching. Thank you so much. We are time is slipping away. We must move on to Luke Alen-Buckley, and Luke, in a similar way, comes from a different epistemic background, perhaps, than one might expect. Undertook a BSc in physics in 2014 before returning to his first love of sculpture. But it was the discipline of physics that gave him a vital understanding of the structure of matter and how those things best sit in place and time. His preferred medium is 340 million year old Kilkenny marble and glacial erratic boulders. Speaking about his practice, Luke says, carving limestone by hand is an act of intimacy and resistance, a slow negotiation with matter. And so Luke treats stone as an expressive partner, assiduously carving and polishing to reveal its mercurial fluid surfaces beneath embedded fossils, veins, and new forms. Luke, you are immersed in your material. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'd firstly like to say to both Lena and Kishwar just how incredible your work is and how much it elevated the show, having such amazing makers around. Anyway, on to my presentation. So I took a slightly different approach. I chose what I believe is a shared inspiration of both Ruskin and me as my starting slide. And these are some Pugin etchings, and they're of these rood screens or choir screens, and they're rather beautiful. And in Ruskin's chapter, The Nature of Gothic, he argues that Gothic isn't a style, it's more a condition of labor, and it allows the workers to vary and to stray and even to fail, and that these decisions are visible in the work. And in a lot of these Pugin screens there is asymmetry and built into it, either by the workers or by the designer, and that imperfection isn't a flaw. And he coined this term changefulness. And I've chosen these because I'm not interested in them for the sort of liturgical viewpoint, but I do love the threshold and the pause and the way that it draws your eye. And as your eye is drawn from the space that you're in into a new space, and the moments that you take to just reevaluate and think. And so I think that that's sort of my work's very much about recalibrating attention and having these thresholds for thought and decision, and then on to decisiveness. And so this is one of the pieces of work that I've just done in this new series called Doors of Perception, and it's been 2.5 years, almost 3 years in the making. And the Ruskin Prize, the John Ruskin Prize, is the first time I've ever shown one of these works, and so it's a great moment to have come into the world. I also got a lot of, I've clearly, joined a bandwagon after Blake and Huxley and Van Morrison and calling it the Doors of Perception. And that's been great. But I think a lot of my inspiration was Huxley, Aldous Huxley, for this. And I think that the patience in looking, truth in making is very interesting, because it's also, the patience in looking is also a very Huxley idea. And it's about changing your viewpoint and taking the time to do that. And the truth in making is obviously very Ruskinian. And I think my work sort of sits somewhere in the middle of that. So next, I've got a little video which I'll talk over the top of, but it was a friend of mine who's been working with me for the last year, and he's taken little bits of footage over time, and so it'll give you a bit of a process and understanding of how I've worked the stone and how it takes so long. And so I live on the Blackwater, so the water is obviously a huge inspiration, and I do carve these very mercurial forms. And they all started off as these diaristic life studies, and they're all these quite intimate studies about my own life and about the people I'm with and the people I surround myself in. And they were all made a sort of a decision. It was whilst I was sort of trying to make big decisions of life, and so these drawings came about. And then they get pushed together, and then I choose my favorite lines from different drawings, and then all of a sudden they get drawn on the stone. And then once they're drawn on the stone, then it's time for me to start cutting. And so I start by drilling, and then go on to the angle grinders, and then from there onto my chisels, which is my main tool. And so it's all air hammers I use. It's all chisels, and this is a technology that's been around for hundreds of years, almost 100 years. These air hammers, and they're incredible tools, and they're very fluid, and they help me immeasurably. They save the arthritis in the arms that I'd get if I was still using a hammer. But And, my pieces are a lot of them are double-sided. Some of them are single-sided and placed on the walls and suspended off the walls. And this whole suspense thing and suspending is very important to me for this work. I want it to feel, firstly, I love the shadow play behind the work. And it feels like that's talking about a passage of time. And with that passage of time, there's that ticking clock. Time to make your decision, time to choose your path and also I love just this looking through into another space and imagining where your life's going to go and how it's going to change, and that how little parts you might see little glimpses if you choose this path, but not necessarily. But most of it's obscured still and all very mercurial. And so these are these shapes that I carve, and so they're supposed to feel very shifting, almost like a veil.
Luke, it's interesting. You've used the word mercurial a couple of times, and I just wondered if you might share with us your definition of that word. What mercurial nature of the material is doing. And it's really interesting to see, and I hadn't appreciated before, the way in which your drawing, your abstract drawing, meets the material. And I wondered whether the caprice or the mercurial nature of the material resists the drawing or not. How do you configure that?
Yeah, well, actually, Lena put it. I can't remember your exact phrase. It would be much more interesting than mine. But that working with a natural material is complicated, and it pushes you as much as you push it, and so that's quite an interesting position to find yourself in. But obviously, stone is heavy. These pieces. The piece in the Ruskin show is almost half a ton, just under half a ton, and the idea is trying to push the material to not stay true to itself. There are marks from the quarry still in the piece, and they're left there on purpose so that it's got some truth to it. But to try and change it and make it feel instead of this heavy, bulky object, to make it fluid. And as you say, I love the word mercurial, and it's so Mercury-like, flowing and moving. And obviously stone doesn't move, but to try and make it feel like it's moving, and catch the light and throw the light in a way that every time you look at it and every time of day, it feels different and the shapes move and the shapes shift is important and valuable to me.
But thank you. What's the relationship though between the drawings, qua drawings, right? As an expressive mode, you mentioned their sort of intimacy, the fact that they're very personal. Again, how does that then meet what you're trying to do with the material? I'm curious to know. So where do those forms, without invading too much on your privacy on what you describe as deeply personal, but where do those forms come from? Are they forms that in a sense come from the pencil or come from the chalk or the crayon, or are you thinking about them as sculptural gestures on the stone, if you see what I mean?
Oh no, when I'm drawing them, it's very much that's my patience in looking, I guess, and I am looking, and I'm drawing from life, and I'm taking the time.
What are you looking at?
So I'm looking. I started this 2.5 years ago, and that was around the time that I'd met my now wife, and I was a sworn bachelor up until I'm now about to have a baby. So so I've had this huge life transformation that's gone on. And it's been exciting. And so there have been, I think when we hit these momentous moments in life, you take stock and you take a pause, and there is always a door in front of you, a threshold that you can pass through or you can deny. And that's what was so exciting about these drawings. And they were about Christabel, and they were about our lives together, and they were little small scenes that are intimate, and you wouldn't get outside of an intimate relationship. And whether that's just a little look across, and so I've just captured these shapes and these moments. And then when I'm transferring it onto the stone, I'm very unparticular, so that the high points, the light points, might become an indent, but I'm not particular on the shape, and all of a sudden they then change into these forms, and that way I'm taking something directly from life, which then becomes very abstracted in the process.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Luke, have you got an image of the work? There we go.
I do. Yeah.
Well, you've got to tell us about the composition of this photograph.
Well, that's my cutting shed. So this is where I do I was very lucky to sort of catch golden hour for the photo, but and it was super, and it was actually rather fabulous to when I saw the open call, because originally I had planned for this piece to be a hanging piece, but that didn't feel true. And having it mounted on my workbench, and this was the workbench I carved it on, and so that sort of roots it in the labor and makes it much more akin to. And I'm so I had to remake the frame and change all of it, and I'm so happy I did. I'm really upset that my workbench, which has been my workbench for 8 years, is now a plinth, and I've got to find a new one. But I think it's found a new elevated life underneath the stone, and I think it's very apt with the piece. And I think the lightness and of the weight of the stone there, catching that light, versus the honesty of the workbench is very real.
Luke, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time. Our hour has slipped by.
It slipped. Yeah, it's honestly, I looked at the time just then. I have no idea where it's gone. Yeah, I have no idea. I can't believe that. But yeah, thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions. Sorry, I've realised I've been so enraptured in Neal's questions. I've been terrible at keeping track. I wonder if we have time, just have a quick sort of a shout out. So there is actually one for you, Luke. Again, I feel like a lot of the talking does explain these questions, but I wonder if there's anything you have to add for this one. So this one, it says, Luke, given that carving stone requires both patience and decisive action, and recalling Ruskin's focus on time and attention, how does time influence the choices and meanings within your sculptural practice?
Well, as I mentioned, these works take 2.5 years to carve. It's all carved by hand. The whole thing is done by hand, and in today's world, it's especially frieze work and pierce relief. Anyone else, I'm sure there are a couple that aren't working with CNC, but pretty much everyone else working in stone is working, especially for this sort of stuff, has moved to CNC just because of the speed and the immediacy and the cost saving. But I think I think that sorry, what was the word? Immediacy that in the question.
Time and attention.
Time and attention. Yeah, well, I think that attention is incredibly important, and you need the time, and especially as I've told my story of where this came from, but the attention is needed on these matters, and it's very much been a thinking mantra carving this, and it's been a long one, and I've come out with the right decision, I believe, but I think that, and the shadow play is very important to me, and that is the passage of time, and it's a ticking clock, and it's a slow and it's a gentle clock, but it is a reminder that time is there, And so that needs to bring attention.
Lovely. Thank you, Luke. And also, it's just to highlight, if no one has, if there might be some people joining us that haven't physically been to the exhibit, but you talked about thresholds, and I thought it was very apt just to mention that your piece actually is at the threshold of the exhibition. It really is. As you walk in, it's so eye-catching, and I love, I love that you mentioned that, because the curatorial decision to do that, I think, ties in, it's always like in hindsight, but having listened to your talk and then looking and sort of having connections to that curatorial decision, I'm like, oh, we made the right choice. It does feel like that. Lovely. So time has absolutely raced past. I'm aware there are some questions that haven't been answered, so I'm going to be emailing all of our artists and speakers in their own time. So some sort of questions. So if you haven't had your question answered this evening, not to worry, because we'll have time. But I just want to say a massive thank you to all of our artists and our speakers, and a massive thank you to Neal as well for chairing that so beautifully. And it really was just a beautiful flow from one to another.